As Mark said, Black Death by Sea, but room for hope. The impact of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic on the blue economy and globalization. Can everybody see me and the presentation? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes. We can see you.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic, as we know, has swept the world, and it's threatened actually the very process of globalization, which arguably and ironically has also facilitated its rapid spread. Although relatively few of those who contracted COVID-19 have died, some 1.5 million have. The sea is the key highway for globalization, and some aspects of the maritime domain are disproportionately vulnerable to disease, because once a disease of any type gets aboard a ship, it spreads through the people on the ship with great speed. One of my colleagues, Peter Cook, who's also an editor on our journal, he was on board HMS Hermes, the British aircraft carrier, in 1982, and they had a stomach bug took hold on board, and it swept through the ship very, very rapidly. The vulnerability of ships and their role as a means of transmitting diseases is nothing new. It was ever thus, and more of that in a moment. For those of you who haven't heard me say this before, there are 100,000 freighters, cargo ships, tankers on the seas, and 90% of everything we wear, eat, and work with goes by sea. I would commend to you this book by Rose George, Deep Sea and Foreign Going, Inside Shipping, the Invisible Industry That Brings You 90% of Everything, which is a really excellent introduction to the importance of the maritime domain. But most of us live on land, and once a ship is outside the territorial sea, about 12 miles from the coast, they are in fact out of sight and therefore largely out of mind. But it's not to be forgotten that they carry 90% of everything we eat, wear, work with, and so on. And the volume of traffic measured by ton miles, and you might have a tanker carrying 100,000 tons of oil, for example, going 5,000 miles, so that it comes up to the incredible figure of 50,000 billion ton miles per year, an absolutely incredible figure. I said it was ever thus, and the previous greatest pandemic in world history was probably the Black Death in the 14th century, which originated in Central Asia, but was transmitted first to Europe from the Crimea, from Kaffa, now Feodosia, in the Crimean Peninsula, and by Genoese merchants fleeing from an attack on Feodosia, Kaffa, by the Mongols. That's the Genoese fortress of Kaffa there. The very word quarantine, which we now apply to people coming from countries considered to be at risk, comes from the Venetian form of the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. And it didn't come into play immediately. In fact, it was 100 years between the first appearance of the Black Death and the Venetians introducing 40 giorni, quarantine. The Black Death accounted for killing perhaps 30% of the European population and a similar grim toll elsewhere. The Black Death was, of course, not a virus, it was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, reached England in 1348 and killed between 30 and 50% of the country's total population. It first arrived in Europe from Kaffa, as I've said, in Genoa and Venice in January 1348. But it was the outbreak in Pisa a few weeks later that was the entry point to northern Italy. That's an interesting coincidence, and it is only a coincidence, but of course that part of northern Italy was one of the areas to be worst hit by COVID earlier this year. As I say, that's coincidence, but nevertheless of interest. It spread quite rapidly through Europe, as shown in this map, to England 1348, and then through Eastern Europe between 1350 and 1353. COVID has, of course, spread much more rapidly because of globalization and modern transport. As I say, it was 100 years before quarantine, as we understand it, was implemented by Venice. It was first implemented in Croatia in 1377. So it took them quite a long time to get the measure of the pandemic, much less time than we have. So we've made some advances at least. Moving forward now to the end of 2019, when a strange flu-like illness was first identified in China. It was declared a public health emergency of international concern on 30th of January 2020, and a pandemic on 11th of March. And these dates are quite important because of what I'm going to say about the maritime response. The most catastrophic sectoral business and economic effect, even greater perhaps than on the airline industry, has been on the cruise liner industry. For 2 decades, cruise liners, cruising, has been the fastest expanding set component of the tourism industry. Another major victim have been major warships on board which the virus can also spread very rapidly. Maritime trade, on the other hand, which carries 90% of everything we eat, wear, use, has been relatively lightly affected. So I'll deal with these 3 sectors briefly in turn. So with the pandemic declared on the 11th of March, the following day, Viking Cruises suspended all their river and ocean services the following day. Princess Cruises, owned by the Carnival Corporation, headquartered in California and incorporated in Bermuda, underlying the international aspects of the maritime world, swiftly followed the same day. On the 9th of April, the US Center for Control and Prevention cruise ships carrying more than 250 passengers and crew. Initially, 100 days, but it's been extended again. Hello?
Excuse me, Professor Bellamy, sorry to stop you a moment. Could we check that everyone else's mic is muted, please? Could
Yes.
All participants in the conference, except for Professor Bellamy and myself for the moment, make sure you're on mute. Sorry for that interruption, Professor Bellamy.
That's all right. It sounded like a zip fastener on a pencil case or something like that. Yeah. Okay. So the no sale order was extended and modified again several times. The first ship to have a COVID-19 outbreak on board was the Diamond Princess, and it was quarantined at Yokohama in Japan for a month. More than 700 people became infected and 14 of them unfortunately died. At that time, the ship accounted for the most reported cases outside of mainland China, where it had started. So cruise lines stopped taking passengers, but of course, it's not only the passengers, it's those who drive the ship. And on cruise ships, also you have people who cater, people who wait, people and people who entertain. So it's all very well saying don't go on a cruise, but you still have to pay those people, and you need to keep the ship safe, even if there are no passengers on it. Well, by the 2nd of May 2020, more than 40 cruise ships had confirmed positive cases of COVID on board. The last of cruise ship infected in that first phase of the pandemic was the Bahamian flagged Artania, which came from Germany, which docked at its home port of Bremerhaven on 8th of June 2020. Meanwhile, on 26th of March, the biggest, most dramatic example of the COVID-19 pandemic on board a ship was the on board the Ruby Princess, another Carnival line ship. The World Health Organization had declared a pandemic on 11th of March, as we've seen, and from 15th of March, Australia banned ships arriving from foreign ports. However, 4 ships already en route to Australia were allowed to land. One of them was the Ruby Princess, which docked in Sydney on 19th of March 2020. Now, it's the captain's responsibility to ensure that the people on board a ship don't pose any sort of threat to the country where they're docking, but for some strange reason, and we're not sure exactly how or why this happened, the passengers, 2,700 of them, were allowed to disembark. Some people on board had shown symptoms of coronavirus, but all the passengers had disembarked before the results came back. And on 24th of March, one person who was a passenger on that cruise died after a positive COVID-19 test. By 5th of April, 11 passengers on the ship had died. More than 30% of all COVID-19 deaths up to that time. Passengers, meanwhile, had dispersed across Australia and also some of them to the United States. So the Ruby Princess was a major cause of the spread of the virus, particularly its influx into Australia. Well, New South Wales police boarded the Ruby Princess on the night of 8th of April, looking for evidence, and there was an inquiry was put in place. This highlights some very important organisational and governance issues. The Australian Border Force is responsible for passport control and customs, while the Federal Department of Agriculture is responsible for biosecurity under the Australian Biosecurity Act of 2015. However, it is up to each state's Department of Health to prevent illness in the community, and that applies to other federal countries, like, for example, the United States. And the reasons for this breakdown in communications between the different agencies will be determined by a later inquiry. I think this underlines the particular problems affecting the maritime domain and the various discrepancies. We've got different kinds of security: national security, border security, biosecurity, and health security, but in fact they are all overlapping and intertwined. Discrepancies between national and state controls and local authorities, another. And some discrepancies that are unique to the maritime domain. In particular, you might have a ship that's Greek-owned, operated by a multinational company based in Los Angeles and flagged in Liberia, for example. And the captain might be a Dane and the crew might be Filipinos. So it's a huge overlapping and complex multinational domain. And then, of course, ships harbour, dock in different states, and all those states have their own rules and regulations. One of the big problems with suspending cruise liner operations was where you put the ships, because they are big. Even our biggest, the biggest cruise liner port in Northern Europe has only got room for about 13 cruise ships. So cruise ships had to be moored offshore because there aren't enough ports big enough to put them in. So we had this eerie spectacle of cruise ships moored, still needing skeleton crews for safety reasons, moored offshore. Here we see a map of Manila, Philippines on the 3rd of June. And you can see the various cruise ships moored between 6 and 15 kilometers offshore. That's the scale, 3 kilometers. So you can see they're moored between 6 and 15 kilometers offshore. This is Weymouth Bay off Dorset on 24th of May. And you can see a number of cruise ships moored offshore, again about 5 kilometers out. And here they are. On the left, the cruise liner Queen Mary 2, sorry, the ocean liner Queen Mary 2, and then cruise ships Aurora, Britannia, Azura, Queen Victoria, going off to the right. Well, the effect of COVID-19 on the tourism industry has been analysed in this recent book published by the excellent Springer Press from Switzerland. Chapter 5 covers airports and Chapter 10 covers cruises. So that's a very important book. I found this article by Monique Gieser, who's a partner in KPMG, from July particularly useful. In the past 5 years, the demand for cruises has increased by 20.5%, and it has been the fastest growing sector of the tourism industry until this year. In 2018, it was estimated that the world cruise industry was worth $150 billion. 75% of the market is controlled by 3 main players, the largest of which is Carnival, The cruise industry generates over $150 billion in worldwide economic activity and supports nearly 2 million jobs. So this is a huge sector. From mid-March, when the suspension of cruise operations began after the pandemic was declared on the 11th of March, the worldwide impact, it's estimated in this study, will be a loss of $50 billion in economic activity, 334,000 jobs, and $15 billion in wages alone. So I put $25 billion in my abstract, but that's probably an underestimate. It depends, of course, which figure you want to take, whether it's overall economic activity or wages. And of course the cost of the tickets, but that's quite a small aspect of the overall income from cruises, because people spend money on board and they spend money when they get off in the countries that the ships call at. Now, interestingly, many of those who booked cruises were offered discounted cruises next year when we hope the pandemic will be contained, and most people tended to do that rather than to take a refund. But of course, the main damage has been the confidence of future passengers who haven't been on a cruise before but might want to go on one. The other main area of impact has been on warships, particularly big warships. And the most dramatic example was the United States ship Theodore Roosevelt, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. First case, 4 cases diagnosed between 22nd and 24th of March 2020. Now, an American aircraft carrier has about 5,000 people on board, typically 3,000 to the ship's company and 2,000 in the air wing. And this outbreak of COVID-19 was attributed to a run ashore by some members of the air wing when the ship docked in Vietnam. So the ship was ordered to Guam, where it docked on 26th to 27th of March. The sailors, then it was evacuated, with the sailors being isolated in the US naval base on Guam. A skeleton crew, of course, had to be left on board to secure the nuclear reactor, provide fire cover, and to disinfect the ship. The captain wanted to get everybody off the ship, but he was ordered to keep people on board. Captain Brett Crozier wanted to get them off because he felt that, given the close proximity that people live in on board a ship, he couldn't contain the virus on board. So, but he was ordered to disembark them, and he was then relieved of his command. Now, I'm not going to take sides in this, but the acting secretary of the Navy relieved him of command. So Crozier was left his ship, and to cheers from his ship's company of 5,000 plus, chanting "Captain Crozier, Captain Crozier." This went viral on YouTube, of course, and it's quite possible that with a change of administration in the United States that Crozier will be reinstated. And I think my personal view is that he did what any good ship's captain did, and put his crew first. It returned to sea in May, but it wasn't the end of it. There was another outbreak on board. Another ship that was affected was the USS Kidd, a destroyer, a guided missile destroyer. But the American Navy has already started learning lessons from the Roosevelt, and in April, an amphibious assault ship provided an intensive care unit, a fleet surgical team, so that the US Navy was getting on top of the problems.
Professor Bellamy, just to
yes.
just say that you've got about a minute left.
Okay, well, very quickly, relatively speaking, the 100,000 ships carrying everything we eat and wear and use have been relatively little affected. That's partly because they now have very small crews, and partly because a lot of the cargoes are taken off by effectively by robots, and robots don't get COVID-19. It's been estimated that global maritime trade will plunge by 4.1%, which, relatively speaking, is very little. And then next year is expected to go up by 4.9%. So that's the graph. And so you can see here we are at 4.1%, but we'll then go up by 4.9%, so back over the zero level next year. So relatively speaking, that's been little affected, and that is partly due to the small crews on modern transport ships now, and the widespread use of automation. I would add that if there was a big effect on merchant shipping, then that would have catastrophic effects on the world economy. But as in the case of the Icelandic volcano, which closed UK airspace for 6 days, for example, we didn't run out of food, we didn't run out of fuel, because it all comes by sea, not by air. Thank you.